G'day. That's positively disappointing. G'day, how are you going? Can you all make sense of my slightly odd, eccentric Swedish-Australian accent, first of all? It must sound like a sales rep for Volvo or Scania, right? No? It's slightly different, right? Okay, I'm seeing a few radio antenna coming up here. As I've been watching you guys here this morning, one of the things that's been striking me in the way that I've been observing you, and I've tried not to observe you in the sort of stalkerish way, but rather in a sort of anthropological fashion out there in the exhibition booth, etc., is that I've noticed that a few of you, even in this hyper-modern era today, are choosing to wear these extremely high-tech devices. Just by a show of hands here in the room, ladies and gentlemen, who is wearing a high-tech, wearable tech device, the analog watch? Just by a show of hands around the room so we can have a look around. This is like 30-40% of the audience. Just by show of hands as well, who's not going to raise their hands no matter what I ask this morning? Okay, there's always a few, and that is a trick question. But my question is, why? In an era of digital disruption, in an era of modern technology, of the virtual, the cyber, of the Internet of Things, of machine-to-machine communications, in an era where we have digital time all around us via our smartphones, our Blackberries, if we're still choosing to use those, via our iPads and our phablets, why do we insist as human beings on wearing these? Style, yes, they just work. Any other reasons? Out of habit? Absolutely. I was in Atlanta, Georgia last year speaking at a conference, and a Gen Y lady in the audience, when I asked this question, she said, because of emotional intelligence reasons. And I said, please explore that with me just for a moment. When she said, well, you know, Anders, when you sit in a meeting and you're really trying to get out of the meeting, it's so rude to take out your iPhone or your BlackBerry to check the time like this, so I just do this instead. I think that, if anything, is sort of this cross-generational commentary on what really constitutes emotional intelligence. Did anyone get given your watch, perhaps by someone close to you, maybe a loved one? Anybody? Fantastic. So you either have some emotional sentiment attached to this piece, or maybe you just have to wear it. It's usually one or the other, right? Yeah. What I'm here to speak about is not necessarily timepieces and clocks or watches, but I do want to explore with you how digitization, how technology, and how future trends are impacting the way we do business. And I'm going to be arguing here today that increasingly what the bus and coach industry needs to do to win the customers' hearts and minds of tomorrow is that increasingly we need to appeal to the customers' increasingly digitized, rational minds, but also keep connecting with their enduringly emotional and analog hearts. The battle for the hearts and the minds will be fought and won by those bus and coach operators who are able to both digitize, but also without throwing the analog baby away with the bathwater. As a futurist, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the idea of the digital world. On the one hand, I love the digital world for its ability to connect us intergenerationally across borders in geo-contextual fashions with our consumers, with our citizens. I love the ability of the digital world to connect this fella, little Max Harpham, in Hornsby, in Sydney, with the world around him. Little Max Harpham is the 9-year-old son of my colleague in my research think tank, Emma Harpham, and her husband, Aaron Harpham. He's a cool kid, as you can see. He's into his skateboarding, his extreme sports, and as a football or soccer fan, I love the fact that this year he won the top scorer award for the Normanhurst Eagles under-9s. This is all pretty cool because little Max Harpham was born profoundly deaf. 9 years ago, when he was born, his parents were told at the hospital that your son has no analog hearing whatsoever. If a freight train went past little Max Harpham's back, he would not be able to hear a sound. But because of a great Australian innovation in medical technology, the cochlear implant, little Max Harpham, who has 2 of these implants, one behind each ear, has the same abilities and capacities to make sense of the world around him. Where there was no analog sense whatsoever, a digital sense has replaced it, which means that Emma and Aaron can pass down their intergenerational wisdom. His peers and his teachers are able to communicate with little Max Harpham. He's able to score goals on the football field. And most importantly, once a year during the Australian swimming carnival at school, he's the only kid that can properly hear underwater. Now, this sort of gives me, as a futurist, digital goosebumps. This part of digitization I love because it's able to connect us to the world around us in a whole variety of new ways. But I also have some, let's call them misgivings around the digital world as well. Because the digital world, and all the family bus operators here in the room would know this, all those family business operators know that digitization can be extremely disruptive if you're not adaptive. And let me tell you a story close to my heart of where a family business has not kept up with these disruptive technology trends and the impact on this particular business. Let me take you back nearly 100 years in history to my native country or native city of Stockholm, to an urban vista that looked a little bit different from what it looks like today. Let me take you back to Stockholm in the 1910s, to an urban vista that was a little bit more black and white, an urban vista where things were kind of a little bit simpler, where people only wore black or white. In fact, things were a little bit more binary, either this or that. This was the urban vista that greeted a man by the name of Georg Johansson, or the son of Johan, which sounds incredibly Scandinavian, Viking, something that's burning. We'll see whether we have an evacuation here later on today. He changed his surname as he became a man of commerce, from the son of Johan to the man from the southern farm, or in Swedish, Georg Sorman. Now, Georg Sorman is my great-grandfather, and Georg Sorman, for many years, from 1916, ran a very, very successful family business in menswear retail. For many years, his business model relied on aspects like word of mouth, for example. He was always about the belly-to-belly, the face-to-face. And his menswear store, for many years, did very, very well because of the connection with people's hearts and, of course, also their minds. But things have sort of changed recently. My mum, now, 3rd generation, runs this little family business of 12 employees in Stockholm, Sweden. And for her, the business environment has completely changed. Nowadays, the customer that used to go into my grandfather and my great-grandfather's store behaves somewhat differently. They will go into Mum's little store. They'll hang out with my mum or her tailor, Hassan, with their little measuring tapes. They'll get free intellectual property handed down, things like pricing, the seasonally adjusted Swedish girth. Gets very cold in Sweden in wintertime. And Mum will tell them and advise them on the supply chain mechanics, the provenance of the products that she supplies them with. She'll tailor things, or at least she'll tell the gentlemen and their wives, their partners, about the particular silhouette and the particular measurements that they might want to go for. And on the way, as the customer browses the environment around them, geocontextually, what happens to my mum is that the customer today, in a way they never used to, they'll say, "Thank you very much for all that intellectual property. We'll think about it." And then they exit the store to the sound of a very, very lonely little bell. They'll go out onto St. Eriksgatan 41, go around the corner, and then they'll place the order on eBay or Amazon.com/fashion. Now, this is very, very disruptive to my mum's business model, as you can imagine. For the last 10 years, her business has barely broken even, or when it's been running at a loss, my mum is pumping in her life savings to protect the jobs of her 12 employees to keep the business alive. Many of you have seen this digitization and this change around you in the last few years. Are we all good? AV desk, by the way. Fantastic. It looks like we've got visual again. Fantastic. Can we have a round of applause for the AV desk? And a hallelujah and a little prayer to make sure that digital technology works for the rest of this presentation. Cool. So let me move forward. We've got one screen working at least, and I'm hearing voices as well. Let me move forward here. So we're all going to be focusing on the future, which is towards the right. So this is my great-grandfather, Sorman. As you can tell, in my family, we have this inheritable disease called a really weird haircut that we share with North Korean dictators. And as you can tell, my great-grandfather must have been a little bit of a futurist because already he's sporting a great pocket square and, as I said, an amazing haircut. Clearly, some things are timeless. For many years, this little business that innovated and created great new marketing strategies like the neon sign, remember when that was innovative? Did very, very well through innovative marketing like this when people used to read newspapers and magazines in public transport. Advertisements like this one won the hearts and the minds of yesteryear's customers. And I should just apologize to the ladies that this particular advertisement was pre-Swedish feminism. But unfortunately, advertisements like this are failing to connect, as I mentioned, for my mum, Birgitta. The encounters with the customer have shifted, and digital data and the customer access to information symmetry today has pulled the carpet from underneath her feet. Her big challenge today is that she doesn't really know where she should position herself on this continuum between, on the one hand, the analog, the face-to-face, the belly-to-belly, and the glass of red wine with one of her clients, or, alternatively, the digital, the virtual, the cyber, a world that she cannot really touch or feel. And my mum dislikes change. My mum's business, her 98-year-old family business, and mum, with all due respect, is perfectly positioned for a world that no longer exists. And in our management consulting sessions, mum calls them family dinners. I mean, imagine how annoying it must be to have a futurist as your son. Someone who's always in there prodding, asking, why do we do things this way? We have a conversation about change and about how we can win the hearts and the minds of tomorrow's customers. And in my belief, the world of the old school and the new school don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. I believe they can coexist. And successful adaptive companies understand that there is a sweet spot between the two. Now, I think the fact that mum doesn't really like change is kind of human. In fact, who remembers the good old days when being nostalgic was the same as being strategic, right? Has anyone ever been through puberty? Okay, these were awkward days, right? Change can be difficult. Has anyone ever thought about changing a partner? If your partner sits next to you, just make sure you don't raise your hands, right? And I don't mean physically exchanging them necessarily, but selling them on the concept of why 2014 or 2015 is going to be different from any other year in history for us. More long walks on the beach, more time at the gym, more time eating organic food. Easy conversation or not? How does it pan out by 21st of January? Change can be difficult, but when the rate of external change supersedes the rate of internal change in your organizations, just like for my mum, you're in trouble. And for the Queensland operators and the New South Wales operators, I know that there's massive change around you, not just in digitisation, but in terms of government contracts and tendering. We have to be adaptive to keep up with this change. Let me give you the terms of reference here before we go into three major waves of change that I'm seeing on the horizon as we look to the future. The analog world is the world of the face-to-face. The digital world is the interface-to-interface. The analog world is about old-school communications. The digital world about new-school communications. One's about the offline, one's about the online. One is about the personal touch. One is about the digital connect. And one, I believe, is about winning hearts. One is about winning minds. And we must do both to succeed in business today and for the foreseeable future. Let me introduce this concept of what I call the Digilog to you. And this video can do it better than I can with a much cooler Australian accent. So tune into the Digilog before we go into three disruptive trends.
Digilog. In a hyperlinked, interconnected and linked-in world, our minds may have gone digital, but our hearts have remained analog. While a digital mind craves convenience, immediacy and continuous information, an analog heart seeks emotion, inspiration and experience. Take your eyes off the changes that are happening in the digital world for even a second, and change will leave you behind. As businesses rush to keep pace with the digital world, too many focus on the digital bling and forget about the analog thing. But remember that an interface can never really replace a human face. So, how does your brand connect with both the digital mind and the analog heart? In the future, anything that can be digitized will be digitized. Already, pages that used to be turned by hand are now turned with a swipe. Newspapers delivered to a doorstep are now delivered to a browser. And analog cash has been replaced by a digital wallet. So the question is, what's going to be digitized next? Whether your business is growing, maturing, reviving or dying, digital Darwinism speeds everything up. And if you're not selling as much, make sure whatever you do that you don't throw the analog baby out with the digital bathwater. Your response to digital disruption needn't be purely digital nor purely analog. Instead, we must become Digilog. Digilog is the sweet spot between digital and analog. It's clicks and bricks. It's your digitized self on Nike. It's eBay's concept store in New York City. It's Apple's online educational platforms and offline concierge. It's Umpqua's retail banking. It's Google's analog vouchers promoting digital advertising, and it's Xerox's variable data and digital print. And it's TED's digital distribution of analog ideas worth spreading. Digilog strategies will enable you to reclaim market share lost to the disruptors. Digilog amplifies a brand's existing equity in the digital market and helps brands successfully navigate this paradigm shift of digital disruption.
So this is the response, the proactive strategic response to change around you in my books. But let me just talk to you quickly about the three major trends that I just want to premise here for a moment, or preview. The reason as a futurist that I love studying trends, sociocultural trends, technological trends, economic, environmental, or political trends like regulatory or tender change, for example, is that as business owners, as operators, as managers, as leaders, you need to realize that the trend is your friend. We need to stay compatible with the major forces in the world around us and externally scan what's going on around us in our business environments and stay on trend with that. And I'm not just talking about fast fashion or staying up with the seasons. I'm talking about longer systemic changes to our business worlds. As an example, I do a bit of work in Asia, and one of my fast-moving consumer goods company clients that's also into hygiene products, have realized that they're currently selling more nappies in Japan to old people than to babies. Why? Because of demographic factors where Japan has an aging population, these guys have realized that rather than making nappies for just the youngsters, they have a better business opportunity looking after the aging population of Japan. My job clearly here is to lower the intellectual rigor of the conversation, as you can tell. But by rebranding the idea and having fashion parades and really cool nappies for an aging demographic, they're trying to reposition what they do. And this is what we're in the business of, all of us as business owners, repositioning and staying relevant in a changing world. The questions I want you to be asking yourself as we go through the three major trends here today are the following. As you listen to these trends, ask yourself these questions. What customer needs and desires does the trend address? Why is this trend emerging right now, and what's fundamentally changing? What new consumer needs, wants, and expectations are created by the changes? How are other businesses from other industries applying this trend in their businesses? How and where could you apply this trend to your business? And what customer groups could you apply this trend to? And what would you fundamentally have to change about your business model to stay on trend? At the end of the day, these questions are helpful, but what we need to remember is when it comes to the very, very end of the day, this comes down to fulfilling fundamental customer needs. At the end, we need to be asking ourselves, what is the human need that you actively solve? And when we find that solution or find that piece, we are better at operating our businesses. Just like John's Plumbing, we repair what your husband fixed. Now, this holds a fundamental truth to that industry. But ask yourself, as a bus operator or as a coach operator, as a manager, as a leader, where do you position your business tomorrow? So the three trends that I'm going to talk about here today is firstly the idea that we're now living in a post-digital disruption society. And the question is, where do you want to position yourself in terms of appealing to the increasingly digitized, rational minds of your customers, your new customers, and maybe even the customers that you've lost over the last few years to the likes of low-budget airlines, for example. The second trend is the mobilization of the consumer, meaning increasingly we are making choices on the go in terms of our public transport or our traveling needs based on our mobile and smartphone devices. And the question is, where do you feature when someone pulls out their mobile phone and they ask themselves, how do we most quickly get from the Gold Coast Convention Centre to Ulaanbaatar Airport? Or Coolangatta Airport? OOL is the short term for it. Do you feature? Can they find you? How mobilized are you to connect with people in a situational context? And the third trend is sort of a counter trend. It recognizes that, yes, increasingly our minds are becoming digitized, but how do we fundamentally connect with people's enduringly emotional hearts? As the video just showed you, how do we make sure that we don't throw away the analog baby with the bathwater? Does that sound like a plan? Cool, because there's no plan B, so this is what we're going to go with. So firstly, the idea of this post-digital disruption society. Is it too early in the morning to talk about X and Y axes? Yes, for some. Some of you are going, no, please bring it on, for all the mathematicians and strategists in the room. On the X-axis in this report by Deloitte Digital called the Short Fuse Big Bang Theory of Digital Disruption, Deloitte Digital realized or recognized that digital disruption is already impacting industries along this timeline. Either a shorter fuse until digital disruption hits your industry, or a longer fuse. On the y-axis towards the bottom, what we have is either a small impact or a rather big impact towards the top. So we all know where my mum sits on this continuum, right? Short fuse, big bang, retail trade up here. Where do you guys find yourselves? Well, some people would argue transport is up here. But this report was released in 2012. This is 2014, and already you guys might be long fuse, but it's still a big bang. It's still a big change for you guys. And many of your industries, your partners, and of course some of your vendors are in spaces where they're already being digitally disrupted. Because of this digital disruption, business models are shifting. And what's happening effectively is that information that used to be physical is now evaporating into the cyber, into the virtual, into the digital. For example, the US recorded music industry looked pretty healthy at the turn of the millennium here, at the very peak, when CDs reached their peak. Now they've been replaced by something else called the digital. And that industry is now swapping analog dollars for digital pennies. Why? Because they did not keep up with change. We listen to more music today than we ever have in history, yet is the industry making money? No, because they didn't keep up with the change. We'll go through how this impacts you guys as well. And I don't get worried just because of this digitization that's been happening recently. But when I look at the consumer and the behavioral shifts of the next generation, this is when I truly get worried. According to AVG IT Security, more 2 to 5-year-olds in the Western world today know how to play Angry Birds on their iPhones than actually know how to tie their shoelaces. Any parents of 2 to 5-year-olds in the room here today? Fantastic. This is not the therapeutic session. We'll have that one later on. But if you guys thought that Generation Y were slightly weird and eccentric, how weird is this next generation going to be? For them, a magazine on the floor or a brochure on the table, it's simply an iPad that doesn't work. These guys are born digital, and the way they access information about your brands, about your tour operators, or about public transports, going to be vastly different from what it's been up to date. These guys are digital natives. They speak technology without an accent, unlike my mother, who speaks technology with a heavy Swedish accent, just like your Volvo or Scania rep, right? These guys think about technology differently, and they interact in a variety of different ways from the consumer of yesteryear. The great American philosopher and management consultant, George Costanza, once profoundly said that for everything important in life, it needs to have a physical package. For your cash, there's your wallet. Is this going to be true tomorrow? Because kids these days already are using your hard-earned analog cash buying virtual shit online. What a business model, right? Take parents' analog cash and then sell virtual, non-existing, non-physical goods in World of Warcraft. Beautiful concept, right? These guys interact differently with the world, yet as human beings, as the adults in this equation, we're very slow to change. I mean, the question is, why do we not engage with these guys in new ways? For people that are now transacting via Google Wallet or tomorrow via Apple Pay, what is the digital data? What are the new consumer insights we can garner about these guys? Because now when we're choosing transport, all of the time we're leaving a digital trail behind us. I was recently in Queenstown doing some work with a real estate company. I stayed behind for a couple of days snowboarding. This is my digital trail skiing at, I believe it was Cardrona. Has anyone been to Cardrona for skiing or snowboarding? Fantastic, beautiful trails. Now remember the good old days of skiing and snowboarding when you had to stand in queues for a really long time because the transaction was very, very slow. Now, today we have RFID or radio frequency identifier tags when we go through the lifts system, which makes it a lot more efficient. For me, I love this because I can get digital data about my transport behavior. I can get a sense of how much distance I covered that day, my max speeds, the vertical I covered, etc. And this is kind of interesting for me because I love to do some digital navel gazing. But what about for the ski resort? Do you think I leave a digital trail for them as well when I use the RFID card? Do you think this helps them in how much staff they should have in particular lifts at a particular time in day? Do you think they can work out the correlation of which time of day, at which angle the sun might be shining at, and how they should be responding and planning for staff, for example? Do you think maybe it helps for the restaurants that are near those lifts in terms of the offers that they might give? Do you think it gives them an insight into the demographics that happen to ski during the week as opposed to during the weekends versus the school holidays? This becomes rich data for the ski resort as a transport system to give us more relevant content all of the time. Now we're leaving digital trails all around us so that providers of services around us can retro design or reverse engineer design products and services that will appeal to our digital minds and our analog hearts. Has anyone heard of the service Netflix? Yeah, fantastic. Is anyone using it or breaking Australian IP rules and using Netflix in Australia? Fantastic, good. Some innovators clearly in the room here. All right, can you see these two illustrations here, House of Cards and Macbeth? These are two series that Netflix produces. It used to be that Netflix used to just send you like a DVD every week or every month that you wanted to watch. Then it became live streaming. But because they're so close to the consumer, they've now started retro designing or reverse engineering series that they know is going to appeal to their customers. Do you notice anything similar between House of Cards and Macbeth in terms of color schemes, in terms of the age of the gentleman who's on the front cover of the poster? Any similarities? I think there's massive similarities. If we look at this analysis here by Netflix, this is what they found through crunching big data about their customer preferences in terms of what works best when they're going to advertise a new series. This way, they get to reverse engineer exactly the product or service that their customers want. Why? Because they have a lot of rich data about their customers. Our preferences for cast, the kind of general age of the gentleman that we want to follow as a protagonist in these two series, and the colors that are the most visually appealing to our digital minds. Who thinks this is a bit scary? All right. Who just goes, this would be awesome? Right? It's a little bit of both, right? It's a little bit of Big Brother, but you see how Netflix, in two series that have both won awards, are using digital data to produce something that's even more appealing to us. The other impact of digitization, of course, is that new players are entering the marketplace, enabling people, consumers, citizens, to share resources in new ways. And I'm going to be arguing here that something that's called the collaborative consumption movement, that some of you guys will have heard about, and shout out to Rachel Botsman, one of my colleagues, for coining this term, is stealing a bit of the thunder of something that the bus and coach industry have been doing for decades. Collaborative consumption is something that sits behind new business models like Airbnb. Anyone heard of Airbnb? Okay, fantastic. A number of you have heard about Airbnb, a massive digital disruptor in the hospitality and the hotels industry. What Airbnb is simply a platform where you as an individual can rent out your spare space, your boat, your shed, your living room, or your entire house on the Gold Coast when you're not around. Now, who would have problems doing that to a total stranger? Okay, fantastic. But what Airbnb does is, just like eBay, it has a rating system, so you know that you can both trust the landlord and the tenant. They hold the money in escrow, and only when both parties are happy does the money change hands. Airbnb now, after only 4 years in existence, has more rooms under management globally than the Hilton chain of hotels. 4 years for Airbnb. For Hilton Hotel, it took 93 years to build up as much inventory in terms of rooms. So what is collaborative consumption? Well, collaborative consumption is when we use resources in new ways. FON is a different example, where people who realize that they may not be using up their entire broadband plans for the month are renting out their broadband to people that might just be passing by and selling that broadband to other consumers. FON is the largest Wi-Fi network in the world. Do you think this scares the bejesus out of the telecom providers around the world? Yeah. So I'm on a Telstra plan. I only use up 80 gigabyte a month. The 20 extra gigabyte, I will sell because I'm not using it. So rather than sponsoring Telstra, I'm making money, or at least saving something off something I already invested. So the question is for you guys, what does this look like, and why is this a disruption in your industry? Here are my two primary modes of transport when I'm on the ground. In Sydney, GoGet, which, depending on your perspective and depending on which research you listen to, takes between 9 and 32 cars off the road. For every GoGet car-sharing car in Sydney, the automotive industry loses between 9 and 32 sales. Is that good for the automotive industry? Right? But what these guys are tapping into is the fact that people want to share resources, pool together. Isn't this just like getting on a bus with 20 or 30 or 40 other people? Yet collaborative consumption is something that's being talked about. It's being highly touted from Silicon Valley to Bangalore to New York to Sydney to the Gold Coast around the world as being the new form of consumption and sharing. I use bike sharing in Stockholm to solve my last mile problems. It's a beautiful thing that interconnects with the public transport around me. It's a seamless experience. And for this, I pay $100 a year to use a bike that previously I might have bought. So the question is, how do you guys get back on the agenda when you're starting to compete not just against other global players, but the likes of Co-Seats or J-Ride, for example, where I can travel up to the Gold Coast for $20 in a Mercedes-Benz because someone happened to travel up from Sydney to the Gold Coast yesterday, and a seat in a Mercedes-Benz was going online for me by a well-rated driver for $20. Who's competing with that price? Right? But this is a new business model. This is how people are increasingly transacting. And it's rehumanizing mobility. And I believe this industry needs to be part of that discourse again. Let me also explore another impact point when it comes to digitization. And this is the fact that increasingly your machines, your buses, your ecosystem of technology and of products can increasingly communicate in smart ways, saving resources, but also driving down costs for you guys and for the consumer. Here's just one example of something you might have heard of recently that used to just be a product, but because of digitization, it becomes a part of a larger ecosystem for the consumer and how they manage their resource use.
We've been working with companies big and small to make this a reality, and we're very excited about what we're able to do.
Up is a combination of a band that you wear around your wrist and an application on the phone that together help track your movement throughout the day. By connecting your Up and your Nest, you can have this complete effortless experience. Because Up's right on the body, we have this rich contextual set of information about what the person's doing in the moment. And so that means those days that you might wake up a little bit earlier, before you even get out of bed, we can let Nest know that, so it can then adjust the temperature in the room to start to be for my daytime. This is about technology, not for technology's sake, but technology in service of a better life, helping us be more human, allowing us to live our lives better.
Why would we ever bring the thermostat and washer together? That's a good question. If you look at it from a perspective of energy consumption, it's an easy one. These are the big energy consumptions at the home, and they're also the one which require a lot of day-to-day interaction with the consumer. If you have already the thermostat communicating to the utility company, it's much easier if there's one signal going to the Nest, and that is disseminated through the household to all appliances to basically reduce consumption now because we're at the peak. It's just a tremendous consumer benefit, it just happens in the background.
So Nest is basically a glorified thermostat for your home, managing how much energy you use, and you can communicate to it via your smartphone on the way home, so it maybe triggers the air conditioning, for example. They used to just sell a single product, but all of a sudden they thought, hey, what if we control the home? What if we're the central intelligence ecosystem in the home, and we start communicating with your dishwasher, your clothing washer, your Mercedes, or your Toyota on the way home, or via your digitized self as you're waking up. It's an interesting system. The question is, how are you using communications like this to make your customer experience even better? So that's digital disruption, and some of the changes on the horizon are already here. But I get sort of worried when I think about this, because I think about digitization, I think about how this fundamentally can also be sort of dehumanizing. My question to all of you is, how do we kind of bring the human aspect back into this increasingly digitized world that we're living in? How do we make sure that hashtag no person gets left behind, or in my mum's case, hashtag no baby boomer gets left behind? Because as we're increasingly glued to our smartphones, our digital devices, our phablets, the question is whether we're running a risk of sort of losing the belly-to-belly, the face-to-face, and the human connectivity. And the question is, how do we sometimes also disconnect to reconnect? How do we use both the digital world and the analog world and bring them together to reconnect with the world around us? Because sometimes it's when we sort of put down technology or our digital accessories that the world starts to make sense. We have better business meetings, better social engagement, we connect better with our families and our loved ones in a new way that's sort of old school cool. And of course, as this Thai ad shows, it brings a little bit of love back into the equation as well. Now, maybe dangerously, recently I've taught my mum how to YouTube. And my mum does believe that being nostalgic equals being strategic. Recently, she sent me this little advertisement to show me that, Anders, some things just cannot be digitized.
Emma. Huh? Emma. Emma.
Every day it's getting on my nerves.
Emma.
Oh, I'm
Emma. Emma.
So, mum is always right. This brings me to my second point here today, the fact that we're all now mobilizing and that we're making a huge evolutionary shift as we have better access to real-time data around us as consumers, but also as operators. This piece of social research was sponsored by the Australian Productivity Commission and the Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2012 to deal and investigate the issue of problem gambling in Australia. Essentially, they asked Aussies, when you say you spend $100, what was the audited amount you actually spent? Now, when Aussies were asked these questions, and I'm guilty as charged here, when we say we spent $100 last month on transport, the real audited amount was $104. Now, that all sort of comes out in the wash, right? Depending on your accounting policies and your family economics. But it gets more worrying. When we say we spent $100 at IKEA last week, the real amount was $132, not $100. The audited amount was significantly more. When we said we spent $100 at the pub last night at Bussies, the real amount was $158. And ladies and gentlemen, never ever have a conference at Jupiter's casino, because when we say we spent $100 at the casino last night, the real audited amount was $735, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'm not going to talk about problem gambling here today necessarily, but what I want to argue is that when we don't have access to financial or rational information as human beings, and we listen to our gut feel, as human beings, sometimes we suck. But this is changing. Let me introduce you to Raj in Kerala, India. Raj is in family business in Kerala. He's in aquaculture. He's a fisherman. For generations, his family, his forebears have gone out to sea and caught the catch of the day and then brought it back to the harbour to sell it at the best price he possibly could. Now, in Kerala, a coastal state in India, he always had a choice between 11 different harbours along the coastline. They were equidistant to where he was catching his fish. But oftentimes, gut feel would dictate where Raj would take his catch of the day back to. Oftentimes, it was his local market, notwithstanding that there were price differentials in the commodity market in those various villages. One day, Raj realized that he'd saved up enough money to buy a Nokia 1100. Do you remember that feature phone? And that because of Bharti Airtel's coverage up to 25 kilometers away from the shoreline, all of a sudden he could make phone calls. What a novel idea. To all his mates in the 11 different harbors, seeing exactly what the price of the hour was. He could even lock in a price before he went back to the shore. Do you think he started making different decisions about his catch of the day? All of a sudden, Raj started making more money than his mates. But his mates were clever. They saw what Raj was doing, and they all started getting Nokia 1100s as well. The Journal of Quarterly Economics, or the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and The Economist magazine got a hold of this story of mobile adoption in Kerala, India. They studied the process over the course of a year, and they found that the net yields of the fishermen went up 8% as a result of mobile adoption, and the price to the consumer went down 4% as a result of less wastage. Now, any economist in the room should have sort of financial goosebumps right now. So what do we use our smartphones for? Snapchat and Twitter, right? And these are all good things, right? In Israel recently, during the conflict with Palestine or Gaza, Israel launched an app that would integrate with the Iron Dome, their defense system, that would activate in your pocket and buzz you on the beach when a rocket was being geocontextual or about to hit your beach so that you could escape. Now, the Gazans didn't have this technology, but if you just look at the counts and the differences in human suffering on both sides, you could argue that technology had something to do with it. So the question is, how do you use mobile real-time data in your business? I'll give you some examples of how you might want to do that. I do a lot of work in the United States, in the Midwest, in agribusiness. And what's fundamentally fascinating to me is how this very old school business is changing with technology. Precision agriculture, variable rate farming, having the ability to put a different type of fertilizer every square inch depending on heat mapping and GPS coordinates of your field. Now, my bank or my financial institution in Australia cannot give me real-time data on how quickly or how slowly my investment portfolio is growing. But in farming, someone can tell me because of geo coordinates and agronomist data, big data, how quickly my soybeans are growing and how much yield they'll get me. This is sort of useful information, isn't it, if you're running a business, right? We can use predictive analytics in new ways. For example, now in the United States, you have something called Duetto, which is helping hotels selling spare inventory with real-time, on-demand surge pricing. If a conference like this comes to town, it helps them use real-time data to surge the price that the hotel gets. Would this be useful for you guys? Using real-time data to make sure that you fill your buses? Cardinal Health in the United States, what they're doing, they're a healthcare company, a pharmaceutical company. They plan where their vaccines are going to go based on Google flu trends. They make sure the vaccines land and the logistics network is optimized to make sure that where the flu is about to break out next based on big data insights, that's where their vaccines are found. Profitable for their business? Could we do something similar? Recently, I was in France. My girlfriend is French, which is a wonderful thing, and sometimes you deal with French mothers as well, which can be more challenging. I was recently in Paris, and Florence, my girlfriend Clementine's mother, was driving us back to Charles de Gaulle Airport. Now, she's done this route hundreds of times, right? Taking the kids and her parents, etc., to the airport. And so I asked her from the back seat, because I wanted the ladies to have some time together in the front seat, I turned on my Waze app on my phone. It's a glorified, crowdsourced GPS, effectively. And I asked Florence, do you want some feedback based on which route to take and when you should slow down or speed up, depending on crowdsourced big data analytics of the road? And she said, ha ha ha, Anders, non, 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 je sais savoir-faire, which means she kind of knows the road. So I sat quietly towards the back. I turned off the sound on my smartphone, but I was still sort of watching the route on the Waze app. The tagline is outsmarting traffic together. However, I couldn't help myself as we started pulling in to Charles de Gaulle Airport, or starting to pull in would be an overstatement. She was still driving at 170 kilometers an hour, as any good French woman does. But one of the other drivers 300 meters ahead of me warned me that there was a cop on the road with a speed camera. And so I relayed this big data insight to Florence. I said, maybe you want to slow down. And she said, ha ha ha, okay, maybe. She slowed down, avoided a €200 fine as a result. What I'm saying is that new insights based on our geo-context around us can help change analog behaviors. One example of this is something that you might have heard of in the news recently, something called Uber. Has anyone had a taxi ride recently? Taxi rides have never been more interesting than now, because Uber is eating the lunch of taxi drivers. It's a massive disruption in their world, but why Uber is so successful is they got surge pricing, which is on-demand pricing that will be variable depending on the demand for their services, but also because they provide a seamless experience. But also what we need to recognize is that London taxi drivers, the most well-educated taxi drivers in the world, they have to sit the knowledge, basically memorizing the whole map of London to their brains, which is magnificent, I think, but apparently there's a new innovation called the GPS. Has anyone heard of it? Okay, so my wonder is that it's taken so long for the GPS to disrupt this industry, but now finally it has. technology can be extremely disruptive, and it's extremely disruptive if you, as a business owner or as a provider of a service, are not adaptive. Here are the recent comments from London as the taxi drivers went out on strike against Uber.
Thousands of London's taxi drivers have gathered here in Trafalgar Square today to protest what they see as a problem in the industry. They believe that TfL and Boris Johnson are failing to regulate properly their industry, meaning they're losing money, and apps like Uber are gaining popularity. The crux of the problem comes down to the fact that cab drivers say Uber's ability to calculate fares on the go and act as a taximeter in private vehicles is against the law. Uber, which operates in over 120 cities in 36 countries around the world, allows customers book and pay for taxis using a smartphone app, which allows users to see exactly where Uber taxis are in relation to their position. Court summonses have already been issued against 6 Uber drivers by the Licensed Taxi Drivers Association in test cases that could affect all Uber drivers in London. The GMB Professional Drivers Union have called the introduction of apps like Uber a hammer blow, and it is clear from this protest in London the union's members agree.
There's no empathy from TfL. Our bosses, Boris Johnson and Peter Hendy, have actually washed their hands with us. And all they want to do is they've took the corporate shilling, basically. And it took me 4 years to do this job. I'm a proud Hackney carriage driver. I don't mind about any kind of competition, but we've got to play by the rules. If they don't play by the rules, then you got to do something about it. But they're not backing us. There's no empathy towards the London taxi driver at TfL, and that's the way we feel at the moment.
And
So who feels a bit of sort of human empathy with this gentleman? Right? I mean, that's natural, right? But what did the strikes achieve? What do you think was the adoption of Uber's services during the week when the London taxi drivers were on strike? The consumer voted with their digits, and mobile adoption of Uber went up 850% in a week. Do you think that's partly because they're not happy with the state of the London taxi drivers' service? They want something more. And by being technologically astute and adaptive, this is the way to win hearts and minds for the future. Let me go to my final point here, and then we're going to wrap up. So I believe that when I sit down with both my mum, who's my toughest pro bono client, but also with my multinational clients, we talk about this sweet spot and the fact that the world of the analog and of hearts and the world of the digital and minds are not mutually exclusive, but that adaptive business operators know that there's a sweet spot in the middle that I like to call the digi-log. Digital minds, analog hearts. How do you appeal to both? I started this presentation talking about little Max Harpham, the little 9-year-old Aussie kid who now has really cool digitally amplified hearing. Now, the digital technology is magnificent, but if it wasn't for the guys at the Shepherd Centre, an Australian charity that are there for families when they've just been brought this news that their newborn has been born profoundly deaf, the technology just wouldn't make sense. They provide him the calibration, insights, and experience. They provide coaching and psychological support to the families. They work closely with Max Harpham's teacher to make sure that they also articulate things in case the batteries ever run out. And they are helping him geo-contextually calibrate his cochlear implants for the football field or for the classroom. The technology wouldn't make sense unless it was for human beings. And the digital doesn't fix all communication challenges. In fact, if you've ever tried predictive digital texting, you'll know exactly what I'm referring to here. Digital is not the panacea to all of this. And even in a world of instant digital downloads or streamable music, nobody really remembers their first digital MP3 download. But vinyl is forever. Even in a world of instant digital downloads, vinyl sales in Australia and the United States is up nearly 20% year on year in a move towards sort of retro revivalism. We mustn't throw away the analog touch points in our business models with the digital bathwater. I really just share this particular slide because when my brother and I are out and about at the pub, people go, "Sing us that song!" Right? Any Scots will know exactly what I'm talking about here. But I'm wondering if there's not more creative ways to become part of the transport discourse, to take some of the media hype around collaborative consumption away from the collaborative consumption movement and to get back on the agenda again. As a football fan, I remember the great Dutch football player Dennis Bergkamp. Any Arsenal fans will know who I'm talking about. This guy had a very, very irrational fear of flying. He would refuse to fly to away games with Arsenal and Champions League. He would catch the bus or the train. Why was he not the brand ambassador of a great coach or bus company in Europe? Why did no one see the potential that a great football player, who now is incidentally a really cool statue outside the Emirates Stadium, sort of ironic that an aeroplane here or an airline is covered by someone who has a fear of flying. But nonetheless, why did he not become a brand ambassador? Huge opportunity, right? Huge opportunity for us to get more creative in the way that we're now appealing to digital minds and analog hearts. I'd like to kind of refer to this comment that was being made about Bavaria or the October Festival here for just a moment. Because when the state of Bavaria recently sat down and thought about their economic future, they thought about how do we retain the best of what we've always done? How do we not throw away the face-to-face or our brand heritage? We're famous for really silly hats, weird, awkward outfits, and really weird dancing. Right? How do we not get rid of that? But also, how do we stay relevant for the future? And someone really smart in the room said, Lederhosen und Laptops. Laptops und Lederhosen. Jawohl! They went, it's not about this or that, it's about bringing both together. The policy of their entire state of Bavaria, which is now the 4th largest biotech center in the world, while remaining true to their heritage, is laptops und Lederhosen. And I think this spirit is what we all must start adopting in our own businesses. I remember growing up in Sweden in the 1980s and 1990s, and German teams had awesome haircuts, like these guys who won the 1990 World Cup. 24 years later, they won the World Cup again. But not just because they played awesome football or soccer, but because they used a German firm called SAP, or SAP. SAP had recognized that in the 2010 World Cup, based on big data analytics, that the average time that every German footballer kept the ball at his feet was 3.4 seconds. The entire push in this World Cup in Brazil was to get that average down. This year, it was 1.1 seconds per player. And the German goalkeeper, Manuel Neuer, hit more successful, effective passes than Lionel Messi in this World Cup. Now, easier as a goalie to hit an effective pass that reaches your next player than for an attacker, but nonetheless, big data was a massive contributor to these guys winning. It wasn't just about Lederhosen, it was about laptops as well. And I think about my travels. Usually I do travel in the air, a little bit like Ryan Bingham in that great movie, Up in the Air, which makes my life seem very tragic. But I think about the kind of ecosystems that I use to keep track of my miles, of where I'm traveling, of my itineraries, and I think, Why am I not getting frequent flyers or frequent busing points? If I go on bike sharing or via public transport or the G, where is my big data mapping where I go? Where are my offers integrated with a coffee place next to the G station here, for example? Where is that geocontextual information that's relevant when I need my espresso shot in the morning? This is a huge opportunity for all of you guys to make sure you offer something that's geocontextual based on the situational aspects of your consumers. And I think about, and I get inspired by ecosystems that are starting to solve the last mile problems, but appealing both to digital minds and analog hearts, like what we're seeing now in Grenoble, for example, where they're building an integrated system using buses, trams, new smart transport from Toyota, as well as bikes, in a way that's integrated, where, for example, if you're sitting at work and you're thinking about, well, you've got to pick up your child, and I should just say that this little video is a nod to the merits of China's one-child policy in a moment. But well, you might be sitting at work thinking about, how do I get home? How do I pick up my kids after school? How do I go shopping, for example? And through a mobile app in your back pocket, you can locate these cool little vehicles. You take your RFID card, which makes the system smarter by the day. Your electronic vehicle gets charged. You can pick up family members or go shopping in these little new vehicles that are being launched this month in Grenoble in France. They're already live in Tokyo, I should say. But this is a new way of thinking about the last mile problem and how you can build an integrated system, making bus operators talk with the rest of the ecosystem and the network around you. You switch from the car to the tram to a car, and this is the way that you create a seamless experience for the consumer. Let me wrap up. Some of you might ask the question, Anders, so whatever happened to your mum's little business in Sweden? Well, we're at 98 years of age now. I should just say, for those of you who want some digital resources following this, and this is also, of course, in the Twitter stream here this morning, where you can access the whole presentation with more extended video coverage and some of the things we missed at the beginning of the presentation. But the business is still around, and recently we've digitized my father. My father is a retired colonel in the Swedish Army, which is a really good career move because we never go to war. Although he always reminds me that he's done his bit both in Kosovo and Afghanistan with international troops. We've recently digitized Dad, and we've turned him into a male model. As you can see, he also has this inheritable disease of the family haircut. Dad does a really good blue steel. But more importantly, we've recently digitized him with the help of some students. Why? Because they're cheap and they're keen. And they're a good source of marketing intelligence. We've recently digitized Dad to talk about the brand heritage, the brand equity, the belly-to-belly, the timeless qualities, but he's done so in a timely fashion. This video was picked up by the major Swedish newspaper, SvD Nyheter, the equivalent to The Australian, for example. And it was then tweeted and Facebooked all over the Twitter sphere to all the digerati around the world, ending in, or resulting in Mum's 2 best months of sales over a decade. And I think there's a correlation. Her revenue is up 11% year on year in a flat economic environment in Sweden at the moment. Why? Because we're playing on this idea of the heritage, the family business, the belly-to-belly, but we're digitally amplifying it and making it geo-contextual to people who happen to pass by outside. So this is Dad wrapping it up for us today, bringing together this idea of the digilog in fighting these 3 trends of change, or waves of change. And you don't need to speak Swedish to understand the gist of this.
Don't try to fool me. Oh, I know all your tricks.
Den blev faktiskt nästan perfekt, för de här blir nästan likadana.
In my corner.
And he's so proud there towards the end that he gets the balance of the two nearly perfectly even. And he goes, and son, and I'm so proud that I did it on live television. Ladies and gentlemen, when you think about these waves of change around you, when you think about the disruptions in regulations, the opening up to global markets, the shifting consumer behavior as a result of technology, when you think about the increasingly digitized rational minds of your customers, your consumers, and your citizens, think about and observe and identify where the trend is, the trend that can actually be your friend. Think about how you take your brand heritage, your family business, or your international business. Think about how you have to reposition it for the future. Think about where you want to position yourself. Learn from collaborative consumption and how the sharing economy is tapping into this idea of better resource use. Think about what you can learn from Uber or Duetto in terms of real-time pricing. These things are now starting to become affordable to you. And finally, think about how you can start appealing both to digital minds and to the analog hearts of tomorrow's customers. Thank you very much for hanging out here this morning.